The embalmers wrapped the throat of Ramesses the Third in a collar of thick layered linen. Beneath it was a cut 70 millimeters wide, driven through the windpipe and the gullet and deep enough to reach the bones of the neck. He would have died where he stood. For more than a century, every examination of that body reported the opposite. No broken bones, no weapon marks, a composed face, and a peaceful end. The linen was never read as anything but care. It was concealment. In 2012, a scanner in the basement of the Cairo Museum found the wound the wrappings had hidden for 3,000 years. The last great pharaoh of Egypt was murdered inside his own palace during a festival by people who lived in it. 3 people planned his death. 2 of them lie today in Cairo. Nobody has ever found the third. 15 feet of papyrus, written in hieratic and acquired by a European collector in the 1820s. It sits today in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, and it is only a portion of what was originally written. Somebody cut the rest away carefully, taking the material and sparing the text. What survives is a court record. It lists the men and women tried for the murder of Ramesses the Third, the charge brought against each of them, and the sentence each received. Dozens of names. A pantry chief called papyrus, royal butlers, scribes, a physician, guards on the doors. Women of the harem, tried without their names being written down. It was compiled under Ramesses the Fourth. That detail matters more than it appears to. The trial took place after the throne had already changed hands. The reason anyone thought it could be done lies in the condition of the state around him. Ramesses the Third is remembered as the last pharaoh to hold the empire together, and he did hold it. He turned back invasions that ended other kingdoms. He built at Medinet Habu on a scale nobody would match again. But the wars had emptied the treasury, and the state that paid for everything had begun to fail at the simplest task it had. In the 29th year of his reign, the men who cut and decorated the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina stopped working. They had not been paid. Their wages were grain. The grain had not arrived, and they walked out and marched on the mortuary temples where the granaries were. It is the first recorded strike in human history. A king was supposed to be the guarantee that the world stayed in order. This one could not feed the men building his own tomb. Then the succession. The heir was the son of another wife, and he was in place. Among the king's secondary wives was a woman named Tiye, and Tiye had a son of her own. She was not the great royal wife, and she was never going to become one. There was no route to the throne for that boy, no legal instrument, no petition, no appeal. There was one route only, and it required the king to die. The papyrus describes what they assembled. Not a single knife in the dark. A structure. Officials inside the palace, servants with access to the private apartments, guards, and men outside the walls who were to raise support once the killing was done. The date chosen was the beautiful festival of the valley, when the court was occupied and the noise of the celebration would cover a great deal. And here the document does something strange. It records every conspirator. It records every punishment. It never states whether the attack succeeded. It says only that the great God had flown to heaven. It speaks in phrases that were never meant to be read plainly, one of which describes a boat overturning. Whether Ramesses the Third died on the day of the attack or years afterwards in his bed, the record that exists to describe the crime declines to say. And it is not a neutral record. It was produced by the side that survived, under the authority of the son who took the throne. It tells us who was tried. It does not tell us what they had actually done. For 3,000 years, only one object could settle that. It was lying in a museum basement in Cairo. Everyone who examined it came away with the same answer, and the answer was wrong. In 1881, a shaft cut into the cliff at Deir el-Bahari was opened, and inside it lay the kings of Egypt. They had not been buried there. they had been moved. 3 centuries after Ramesses the Third died, priests working through a period of sustained tomb robbery gathered the royal dead out of their opened chambers and hid them in a single unmarked hole in the rock. More than 40 bodies stacked along a corridor. Seti the First, Ramesses the Second, Thutmose the Third, and among them, Ramesses the Third. At the end of June 1886, Gaston Maspero, head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, unwrapped him in front of an audience. This was the moment the papyrus was supposed to be answered. Under that linen there was either a wound or there was not. The court record was either describing a murder or describing an attempt. There was nothing, no fracture, no blade mark across the ribs, no damage to the skull, no defensive wound on the hands, no break anywhere in the body. The arms were crossed on the chest in the correct royal position. The face was composed. Everything on that table was consistent with a man in his 60s who had died of the things men in their 60s die of. The mummy was x-rayed in the 1960s. The images added nothing. No trauma. The reading did not change. It is worth stating plainly that this was not carelessness. The men who reached that conclusion were not reading the evidence badly. They were reading it correctly. Court documents produced by a victorious faction are among the least reliable texts any ancient state leaves behind. Conspiracies against rulers fail far more often than they succeed, and the outcome fitted. The designated heir took the throne. The plotters were arrested, tried, and sentenced. The queen's son never ruled for a single day. That is not what a successful assassination looks like from the outside. That is what a foiled plot looks like in every particular. So the conclusion was drawn and it held. The conspiracy had been caught before it could act. Ramesses the Third survived the attempt and died sometime afterwards of age or illness in his own bed. Tiye and her son entered the histories not as regicides but as failures. Ambitious, dangerous, and not quite competent. It was also a clean shape for a story. The plot exposed, the rightful heir enthroned, order restored. A story that Tiye is usually doing work beyond description. And the reason it stood for 100 years was mechanical. An X-ray is a shadow. It passes through soft tissue almost unimpeded, and it stops at bone, which makes it excellent at finding fractures and close to useless at finding cuts. There was no fracture in the neck of Ramesses the Third. The blade had gone through the windpipe and the gullet and reached the vertebrae without breaking them. Everything the weapon had done was done in tissue, and the tissue was under the collar. The embalmers had built the neck up in layer after layer of linen, thick enough that a shadow image could not resolve what lay beneath it. The evidence had been in the room in 1886. It had been in the room in the 1960s. Nobody had a way to see it. What was needed was an instrument that could take the wrappings off without touching them. It arrived in the basement of the Cairo Museum in 2012, and the team operating it had come to study embalming. In 2012, an international team took the royal mummies of the New Kingdom into a computed tomography scanner installed in the basement of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The work was led by Zahi Hawass, then head of Egypt's Antiquities Service, with Sahar Salim, a radiologist at Cairo University, and Albert Zink of the Institute for Mummies in Bolzano. Their results were published in the British Medical Journal in December of that year. They had not come to investigate a murder. The project was a study of mummification technique across the royal dead. A computed tomography scanner builds a body back in cross-sections, slice by slice, which means the wrappings can be taken off without anyone touching them. They worked down the body of Ramesses the Third. Then the neck came onto the screen. The wound was 70 millimeters across, nearly 3 inches. It ran through the front of the throat, and it had cut everything in its path, the windpipe, the gullet, the large vessels on either side, and it had gone deep enough to reach the 5th, 6th, and 7th vertebrae of the neck. There is no version of that injury a man survives. He would have been unable to breathe or to speak. Death would have come in seconds. Then they looked into the wound itself. There was an object inside it, small, dense, and bright on the image, sitting in the opening where the blade had gone. It was an amulet, an eye of Horus, the protective symbol worn across Egypt by the living and the dead, placed into the cut and left there. The eye of Horus was itself a wound. In the myth, the god loses the eye in combat with his uncle, and it is made whole again. It is the Egyptian symbol for a thing that is damaged and then restored. Consider what that requires. The embalmers had the body of the king in front of them with his throat opened. They could not repair it. So they put a healing charm inside the injury, built the collar of linen over the top of it, and sent him into the afterlife with the wound, dressed in the only way they had. The men preparing the pharaoh for eternity knew exactly what had been done to him. They wrote nothing down. They worked around it. The papyrus had not exaggerated. It had understated. The conspiracy in the harem was not an attempt. It was not caught in time, not intercepted at the door, not foiled by a loyal guard. Ramesses the Third was killed in his own palace during the festival in the manner the plotters had arranged, and the record produced afterwards declined to say so. And yet the plot failed. This is the part that sits awkwardly against everything else. Tiye's son never took the throne. The designated heir was crowned as Ramesses the Fourth, and within a short time the people who had killed his father were standing in front of a court he had appointed. The conspirators achieved the murder and nothing else at all. They removed a king and delivered the throne to the exact man they had planned to remove it from. The 2012 reading was a single decisive stroke. One assassin, one blade, one cut delivered from behind while the king's attention was elsewhere. It was consistent with everything on the screen. 4 years later, the same two researchers went back through the same scans and found something at the other end of the body that made that reconstruction impossible. Sahar Salim and Zahi Hawass returned to the scan data for a full re-examination of the New Kingdom royal mummies, published in 2016. They were not looking for anything new on Ramesses the Third. The neck had already given them their answer. They found the foot. One of the pharaoh's big toes had been cut off, not crushed, not broken, not lost to decay or to rough handling in a museum, severed, cleanly, through the bone. The bone showed no healing. None. Bone begins to respond to injury within days, and there was nothing on that surface to indicate the body had lived long enough to start, which fixes the moment. The toe was taken at the time of death or in the minutes before it. Then the shape of the break. A cut throat is made with a blade drawn across the front of the neck. It is a slicing action delivered by something with a long edge and no great weight behind it, and it leaves soft tissue divided and bone untouched. That is precisely what the neck showed. The vertebrae of Ramesses the Third were reached by the blade and not broken by it. The toe was not treated that way. The bone was fractured in a pattern produced by a heavy-edged weapon swung downward with force. An axe, a sword. Something that chops rather than cuts. Two weapons, two entirely different mechanics. One body, and neither injury with time to heal before the other arrived. Salim's conclusion is that he was attacked from more than one direction at the same time. Somebody in front of him, low, with a heavy blade. Somebody behind him with a knife across the throat. She has said plainly that the evidence indicates several assailants using different weapons, striking simultaneously. And there is one more detail in the scans, easy to overlook and difficult to put down afterwards. The embalmers made him a new toe. They rolled linen into the shape of the one that was missing, fitted it into position, and wrapped the foot so the body would go into the afterlife complete. They repaired him in both of the places his killers had opened him, the throat with an amulet, the foot with linen, two quiet acts of restoration performed on a corpse by men who then said nothing to anybody for 3,000 years. What this does to the story is structural. Every reconstruction before 2016 imagined a single figure moving in the dark. A poisoning. A servant bought off. One trusted man behind the king with a knife. That is not what the body describes. The body describes several men entering a room together, armed differently, and attacking a living god on the ground where he stood, while the noise of the beautiful festival of the valley carried across Medinet Habu and covered whatever sound was made in there. It was not stealth. It was force, applied by a group, in a place where the king should have been safest, by people who had walked past his guards because they were his household. What the scans cannot tell us is how many. Forensic imaging can count weapons, it cannot count hands, and it cannot say who held them, or in what order they moved, or which of them was the one that ended it. Of everyone who went into that room, the papyrus identifies only one by his relationship to the man on the floor: his father. And in the same shaft at Deir el-Bahari, in a plain wooden box with nothing written on the outside of it, Maspero had found a young man who appeared to be screaming. The coffin was plain, no inscriptions, no dockets, no name written anywhere on it, in a shaft where every other occupant had been identified by the priests who put them there. Inside it was a young man wrapped in an animal hide. The 2012 study identified it as goat. Maspero, unwrapping him in the same season he unwrapped the king, recorded it as sheep. Either way, it was the wrong material. Egyptians wrapped their dead in linen. Hide of that kind was ritually unclean, and no royal body in Egypt had ever been found in it. His hands and feet were bound with linen strips. His mouth was wide open, and the mummification had barely been performed. There was no incision on the left side of the abdomen, the standard opening through which embalmers removed the organs. The organs had not been removed at all. The brain was still in the skull. The most basic acts of Egyptian preservation, the acts that made an afterlife possible, had been skipped entirely. Maspero wrote that everyone who saw the body firsthand thought the man looked as though he had been poisoned. He had no name to give him. The catalog recorded him as Unknown Man E. For more than a century, he collected theories: a Hittite prince murdered on the Egyptian border, a nobleman who had died abroad, somewhere with no access to embalming, preserved as well as local priests could manage and shipped home, a foreigner buried in the custom of his own people. The 2012 team took genetic samples from him and from Ramesses the Third. The two men shared the same Y chromosome haplogroup, which passes only from father to son and is not shared with anyone outside that line. They shared half of their autosomal markers. The relationship was the closest one the test can establish. Unknown man. E was a son of Ramesses the Third. He was between 18 and 20 years old when he died, and the compressed skin around his neck is consistent with a violent death. The papyrus records the sentence. The king's son was found guilty and left where he was, and he took his own life. But the papyrus does not use his name. The court gave him a different one. It appears in the document as Pentaware, and Pentaware is not what his mother called him. It is what the men who tried him decided he would be called instead. His real name was taken out of the record deliberately, and it has never been recovered. Nobody alive knows it. Understand what that was for. In Egyptian belief, a name was not a label. It was a component of the person, as necessary to survival after death as the body itself. To speak a man's name was to sustain him. To erase it was to end him permanently, in a way that killing him could not. They were not content to execute the king's son. They removed him from existence and left the body where it would be found, badly preserved, in a hide, in a box with nothing on it. 3,000 years later, we are still calling him by the name they chose. The sentence is still being carried out, by us, every time the story is told. And the identification is an inference, a strong one, but an inference. The DNA establishes a father. It does not establish which son, and Ramesses the Third had others. The open mouth may be nothing at all, since jaws commonly fall after death. 2 of the 3 are now accounted for, which leaves the woman who planned it. The papyrus is exact about the men. It gives their names, their offices, the specific act each was charged with, and the sentence handed down. A pantry chief, butlers, a troop commander, scribes of the treasury, dozens of them, itemized. The women are not treated that way. The accused women of the harem appear as a group, without names, without individual charges, without anything to distinguish one from another, with a single exception. Tiye is named. In a document that took a prince's name away and did not bother to record the names of the other women at all, the one woman identified is the one who planned the whole thing, and then it stops. There is no verdict against her, no sentence, no method of execution, no permitted suicide, no exile, no mutilation, no reprimand. The papyrus follows every other principle in this case to the end of their life and then declines to follow her. The person the entire conspiracy belonged to falls out of the text and does not return. Nothing outside the document fills the gap. No tomb has ever been identified as hers. No mummy has ever been attributed to her in the Deir el-Bahari cache or anywhere else. There is no statue, no relief, no cartouche, no funerary equipment. Susan Redford, whose study of the conspiracy remains the standard treatment, works on the assumption that she cannot possibly have survived it. Others have suggested a private execution, carried out away from the court to avoid the spectacle of a queen on trial, or that she was permitted the same end as her son. All of that is inference drawn from an absence. The record does not say, and no object has ever been found that does, which produces the strangest result in the case. The punishment we can document in detail was inflicted on the son. We know what was done to him, we know why, and we know it worked, because his name is gone, and ours is the generation still using the substitute. The woman who conceived the plan, recruited the household, chose the festival, and set the date, is the one thing 3,000 years of documents, excavation, genetics, and imaging has failed to produce. What happened afterwards is a matter of record, and it is not dramatic. Ramesses the Fourth took the throne. He held it for 6 years. The borders stayed roughly where his father had left them, and the country stayed intact, and it never again exercised power outside them in the way it had. The kings who followed grew shorter reigns and thinner authority. Within a century, the new kingdom was over. The temptation is to make the murder the cause of that. It was not. The treasury was already empty when Tiye began recruiting. The grain was already arriving late. The men building the royal tombs had already walked off the job and marched on the granaries because nobody had paid them, and that happened 3 years before anyone entered the harem with a weapon. A palace in which a group of servants, officials, and wives can decide to kill the king and get close enough to do it. It is a palace that has already lost something. The conspiracy was not the disease. It was one of the things the disease produced. And Egypt did not record it as either. The papyrus was written to demonstrate that order had been restored by a court that could not keep order among its own judges. The scanner in the basement answered the question that had stayed open since 1155 before the Common Era. It also showed us, precisely and unmistakably, how much of this story was destroyed on purpose. They lie under the same roof in Cairo, one of them in a collar of linen that held a secret for 3,000 years and was never meant to be opened, the other in a hide, under a name his father's court invented for him. Everything this case has given up was surrendered by something the Egyptians could not edit. Bone, tissue. A chromosome passed from one man to another. Everything they could edit was edited, and it stayed edited. The verdict on a queen, the name of a prince, the manner of a king's death, written down in code by people who knew exactly what had happened. We know what Tiye did, we know what it cost her son, and what it cost the man in the linen collar. We have never found her, and the men who wrote the only account of her made certain that we never would.